If anyone destroyed his confidence, but then proved he changed, would you have the courage to love this person again? Hi, I'm Yuna, and I welcome you to Happiness of Love. Get ready for an exciting story that will leave you amazed. Enjoy the video, and may God bless you and your entire family. Have an amazing day. Thomas Lancaster slid his fingers through the gold clock on his wrist, checking time with impatience. The charity party at the Los Angeles five-star hotel should be an opportunity to expand your business, close agreements and, of course, display your irresistible charm. But so far, nothing entertained him. He leaned against the chicken counter of the event, watching the guests move through the brightness of the crystal chandeliers. Women were throwing glances toward them, some approaching with calculated smiles. He knew exactly what they expected from him. A flirting, an empty promise, maybe even an unforgettable night. But Thomas was already bored. It was always the same. It was then that he saw her. She didn't fit there, wearing a simple light blue dress, which contrasted with the extravagant jewelry of other women. She walked the hall as if lost. There was no artificial posture of those who knew it was observed. There was no ostentation, no interest in the luxurious environment around. There was something about it, an air of lightness and unpretentiousness which immediately captured his attention. Lucy Harper was holding a leather-bound book against her chest, trying to ignore her suspicious looks she received from the waiters. She shouldn't be there, that was obvious. He had gone to the hotel just to deliver a rare copy of Edgar Allan Poe to a collector who had ordered his small bookstore. But somehow it had been lost in the middle of that extravagant event, where champagne flowed like water, and the guests looked out of magazine covers. She took a deep breath. Okay, no panic. I just needed to find a way out without drawing more attention. But before he could move, a serious and confident voice cut his line of reasoning. Interesting. You look different from other women here. She turned and found an absurdly handsome man staring at her with a smile that overflowed self-confidence. The dark suit seemed to him, the perfectly combed hair, the relaxed posture of those who knew exactly who it was and who he was became clear immediately. Thomas Lancaster. Lucy had heard of him. The CEO of Lancaster Enterprises. Playboy. Billionaire. The man who lived in the tabloids, always surrounded by models and socialites. She blinked, surprised to have attracted her attention. I hope this is a compliment, he said, adjusting the book in his arms. His smile widened. Definitely. You don't look impressed. Because I'm not. Thomas arched his eyebrows, intrigued. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he didn't expect to feel that night: curiosity. Lucy, however, was not interested in prolonging the conversation. Well, it was a pleasure. Now, if you excuse me. She tried to leave, but he blocked his way softly, raising a fun eyebrow. Are you sure you want to leave? Yes, I have. Thomas released a low laugh. This is new. Lucy just smiled, without being shaken. So, without saying anything else, he turned and left the hall, leaving Thomas behind, still, with a fun glow in the eyes. She was the first woman to reject him, and at that moment, he decided that he wouldn't leave. That Thomas remained standing in the middle of the hall, noting Lucy disappear among the guests. The echo of his rejection still pulsed into his mind as an out-of-tune melody he could not ignore. That didn't happen. Never. Women always smile as he approached. They always leaned their heads slightly, threw their hair to the side, laughed at their jokes even when they weren't so funny. There was always a brightness of interest, either for him or for what he represented. But Lucy Harper, she treated him as if he were just another man. He narrowed his eyes, feeling an unexpected heat growing inside him. It was not anger. It was not irritation. It was something more dangerous. Something he hadn't felt for a long time. Intrigue. For a moment, he stayed where he was, taking a sip of his whiskey, savoring the alcohol ardor as he tried to rationalize what had just happened. Then one of his friends approached. What was that? Asked Brian Reynolds, his partner and business partner, pursing his forehead as he looked in the direction Lucy had disappeared. Thomas smiled, a predatory glow in his eyes. That, my friend, was something rare. Brian studied him for a moment before his snort. You're interested in her. Interested is a very weak word, Thomas said, turning the glass between his fingers. I need to know more about her. Brian laughed. And I need another whiskey. I don't know why you get on work. It's just another girl. Thomas did not answer. Because I knew it was not true. Lucy Harper was not just another girl. Lucy felt the fresh air of the night kiss her skin as soon as she left the hotel. Her heart still beat fast, but not for the reason that Thomas Lancaster would probably want it to be. She couldn't deny that he was impressive. Too beautiful to be real, with a sharp smile and confidence that could move mountains. But it was exactly that kind of man who didn't impress her. The kind that thought everything was within reach, that a seductive look and a well-placed joke were enough to achieve anything, just anyone, she sighed, walking to her car. There was something about him, however, that made her wonder. A glow in the eyes, a momentary hesitation when he realized that his usual tactics were not working, but that didn't change anything. She put the rare book in the passenger seat and started the car. That had just been a deviation at night. A random encounter with a man who, within a few minutes, would have already forgotten that she existed. Or at least that's what she thought. Thomas didn't sleep well that night. He tried to ignore the way Lucy looked at him without interest. He tried to convince herself that she meant nothing, that it was just a curious moment in a boring night, but the more he tried to forget her, the more he remembered her the next day. Sitting at his office at the top of the Lancaster Enterprises building, Thomas spinned the pen between his fingers as he stared at the city through the glass windows. Brian entered without beating, carrying a cup of coffee and a skeptical expression. You are obsessed. Thomas arched an eyebrow, but did not deny it. I like challenges. This is not a challenge. She is a woman who clearly wants nothing to do with you, and that's exactly what makes you interesting. Brian laughed and threw a newspaper on his table. Well, if you want to know more about her, you're lucky. It was not difficult to find her. Thomas took the newspaper, his eyebrows frowning slightly when he saw a short article on a bookstore in the city center, the Literary Refuge, the small bookstore that delights Los Angeles. Below the title, a photo of Lucy Harper, smiling softly, holding an old book in her hands. Thomas passed his thumb on the image, a slow, dangerous smile forming on his lips. So this is where you hide, Lucy? Brian snorted. Do you really go after her? Thomas got up, adjusting the suit, his decision already made. I don't lose. He took the car keys and left, determined he would find her and he would make her interested in him, cost what she costs. The door of the small tallow opened with a soft tilt of the bell stuck to the top. The family aroma of aged paper and newly set off the air, filling the space with a comforting heat. Lucy Harper raised her eyes from a book that was cataloging behind the counter. The soft light of the early afternoon crossed the large windows, creating a golden shine over the wooden shelves full of time-forgotten stories. She liked the tranquility of that place. From the fact that every corner of the bookstore carried memories and secrets within its worn pages. It was his refuge, a space away from the chaos of Los Angeles and, especially, far from people like Thomas Lancaster. Or at least, that's what she thought. Look. The deep, blatant voice of a blatant charm cut the air like a very sharp knife. I didn't imagine my day would include a trip to the 19th century, but it seems I came to stop in a museum. Lucy knew immediately. She looked up and, to her irritation, he was there. Thomas Lancaster, stopped at the entrance of the bookstore. As if they were the owner of the place. He wore a casual suit, impeccable as usual, but without the exaggerated formality of the previous night event. It seemed a little more accessible, almost unpretentious. But the eyes? The eyes still carried that malicious glow of those who always got what they wanted. Can I help? She asked, with the measured patience of someone she already knew about what it was going to give. Thomas smiled like he was having fun. I believe so. He walked slowly through the sebum, the soles of the shoes echoing slightly against the aged wood floor. His fingers slid lazily in the books, as if he were really interested in something there. But Lucy knew better. How did you find me? She asked, closing the book in her hands. He shrugged, stopping in front of a classic bookcase. Let's say I have my resources, Lucy snorted. Of course he had. And why exactly are you here? Thomas turned to face her, relying casually on the shelf. Maybe I was intrigued by the only woman who had the courage to reject me without hesitation. Lucy crossed her arms. Without shaking. Well, then your curiosity is satiated. You can go now. He laughed, a severe and slightly provocative sound. You always send customers away. Customers buy books, she countered, arising an eyebrow. Thomas looked around and then, without warning, took an old volume from the shelf and placed him on the counter. Excellent. I will take this one. Lucy looked down at her cover and sighed. You want to tell me that you really want to read Pride and Prejudice? He smiled, enchanted by the irony of the choice. Well, considering the circumstances, it seems appropriate. Lucy squeezed her lips to contain a smile. They are $150. $150? Thomas arched his eyebrows. Genuinely surprised. It's a rare edition, she replied, taking the card machine. He pulled his wallet without hesitation and handed the metallic black card without even blinking. Ready, he said, taking the book. Now can I stay? Lucy snorted, returning the card. You really think you can buy anything, don't you? Thomas leaned a little over the counter, his eyes shining with challenge. So far, it has worked very well. Lucy stared at him for a long moment before taking a deep breath. Listen, Thomas, I know your type. I know you are used to winning any woman you want with a smile and a few well-chosen words. But I am not that kind of person. He watched her closely, as if he was analyzing every nuance of his expression. Then, instead of retreating, he smiled. Again, this time with almost dangerous calm. "You think you know all about me, Lucy, but I bet you would have a chance. I would find that I can be more than a spoiled and arrogant CEO." Lucy blinked, surprised by the subtle change in his voice. For a second, it was almost convincing, but then, she remembered who he was. She took the book he bought and pushed him toward him. "Well, I hope you enjoy reading, Mr. Lancaster. Now, if you don't care, I have a job to do." Thomas took the book. Without haste, without taking his eyes on her. He realized what was happening. Lucy was running away, not exactly him, but what he could represent, and he was not the type who accepted a no response so easily. He held the book with one hand and, before leaving, leaned slightly close to her, enough for his voice to sound low and provocative. "I see you soon, Lucy." Then, without another word, he left the bookstore, leaving her alone in the silence loaded with thoughts. Lucy closed her eyes for a moment and sighed. She knew that was not the end. It was just the beginning. Lucy Harper thought that Thomas Lancaster would lose interest. He thought that, like any spoiled playboy, he would get bored quickly and go to his next achievement, but she underestimated the stubbornness of a man who had never heard a no without turning him into a personal challenge. The next morning, when Lucy arrived at the bookstore carrying a coffee and a pile of new copies to catalog, he found a black sports car parked in front of the entrance. And, leaned against the vehicle door, with a carefree smile and a coffee in his hands, it was Thomas Lancaster. "Good morning, Harper." She stopped in the middle of the step, her stomach rolling with a mixture of exasperation and, perhaps a minimal feature of fun. "Did you lose something?" he asked, pretending disinterest while unlocked the bookstore door. "Just my time," he replied, following her inside like a usual client. "But for some reason, I decided to waste him here." Lucy let out a sigh and dropped her things at the counter. "Thomas, I really have work to do." "Don't you have a company to run?" he shrugged, sliding his hands on the pockets of the suit. "I delegate." "How convenient." She turned to organize new books, deliberately ignoring his presence. But Thomas didn't seem uncomfortable. In fact, he seemed even more interested. He walked slowly through the bookstore, watching everything with a curious look. For the first time, it seemed genuinely interested in space. "Not just Lucy, you really like this place, don't you?" he asked, taking a hardcover book and passing his fingers through the title in gold letters. Lucy hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes." Thomas looked up at her, waiting for her to continue. She sighed and dropped the book she was holding. "I grew up surrounded by books. My grandfather had a small bookstore, and I spent hours here. When he passed away, I decided to continue with the business." Thomas did not expect this answer. He studied her face, the way his eyes softened slightly when talking about his grandfather. For a moment there was no resistant and sarcastic woman who constantly challenging him. There was only Lucy, someone who found a home between pages and words, and somehow it affected him. "You're different," he said, almost without realizing it. Lucy looked at him suspiciously. "Should that be a compliment?" He smiled. "For sure." She rolled her eyes and returned to work, but Thomas noticed a small smile on her lips. And that was enough to make him come back the next day. And the other. "Is he still here?" Mia, Lucy's best friend, whispered behind the counter, spying through the shelves. Lucy sighed, closing a book harder than necessary. "He has been here for 3 days in a row." "That's weird." Mia looked at Thomas, who was casually flipping through a book on one of the shelves, wearing a flawless suit, but clearly without the slightest intention of buying anything. "Okay, I'll talk." "He is tasty." Lucy closed her eyes, frustrated. "Mia, what? You have already noticed that? You have eyes." Lucy snorted and organized the books again. "He's arrogant, convinced, and clearly has a lot of free time, but he's interested. He's bored. This is a game for him." Mia arched her eyebrows. "He is sure? Because he has been there for 20 minutes staring at a copy of Moby Dick like an alien code." Lucy looked over her shoulder and saw Thomas standing in front of the classic shelf, frowning to a book as if trying to solve an impossible mathematical problem. She couldn't avoid a small smile, but quickly if he forced he returning to work. She wouldn't be impressed. The next day, Thomas arrived at the bookstore with a plan. He had realized that Lucy liked subtlety. That his usual approach, misplaced charm and excessive compliments, did not work with it. So he decided to try something different. When Lucy entered the bookstore that morning, she found a beautiful copy of Omar dos Ventos howling over the counter, with a discreet tape around. She frowned and took the book. "What is that?" Thomas, who was flipping through a newspaper in the next chair, looked at her casually. "A gift." Lucy blinked. "Oh, you think you can buy me with books now?" "I don't think anything," he replied, carefree. "I just heard you say this was one of your favorites, so I found a special edition and brought you." Lucy opened the book, feeling the weight of the old pages. It was, in fact, a wonderful addition, and that disarmed her more than anything. She looked up at Thomas, suspicious. He wasn't expecting a thank you. I wasn't trying to impress her. He had heard. She swallowed hard and closed the book carefully. It doesn't change anything. Thomas smiled slowly, supporting his chin in his hand. I know. Lucy put the book aside, not knowing how to process it, and for the first time, he felt that Thomas Lancaster could be a much larger problem than he imagined. Thomas Lancaster had already gained everything he wanted in his life: companies, cars, mansions, women. Nothing had never been denied. If something aroused his interest, he just went after. He could get effortlessly, without hesitation. So why the hell? Lucy Harper still occupied her thoughts. He caught himself staring at the ceiling of his luxurious apartment in Los Angeles, the messy sheets around him. It was late, but sleep didn't come. Weeks ago, Lucy was present in her routine, in a way that no woman had ever been, and that bothered him. He didn't just want to conquer her. He wanted to understand her. I wanted to know why her eyes were dark when she spoke from the past. I wanted to understand why she resisted so much to the idea of allowing herself to feel something for him, and worse, I wanted her to see him beyond the facade, and that was dangerous. He never wanted someone to see beyond what he allowed. Lucy, on the other hand, was busy trying to ignore the fact that Thomas Lancaster had somehow become part of her daily life. The man just didn't leave. He appeared in the bookstore almost every morning. He didn't make great seductive speeches, he didn't play charming blatantly as he had done at the beginning. He just was there. I took a book, pretended to read, casually talked to her. Sometimes it brought coffee. Sometimes he asked questions about books that clearly didn't interest him, but she loved to answer, and that was making things much harder because, despite everything, despite his instinct shouting to keep him away, Lucy was beginning to see him differently. He began to realize the small moments he lowered the guard, the genuine smiles. The way he frowned when he tried to understand something she explained, but none of this changed the fact that Thomas Lancaster was still a man who could destroy his heart without even realizing it. And she didn't have time for that. Thomas knew he needed a right movement, something that broke that barrier between them, and that's how, one night, he entered the bookstore holding a black envelope in hand. Lucy looked up, surprised to see him so late. "You haven't had your daily dose of pretending you read?" she teased, but he didn't smile. "I have an invitation to you." She frowned when he put the envelope over the counter. "An invitation? A charity event tomorrow night," he explained, without looking away. "I want you to go with me." Lucy blinked, trying to absorb that information. "Thomas, before you say no," he interrupted her. "Just think about it," she sighed, crossing her arms. He hesitated for a second before answering. "Because I want to spend a night with you out of here." The words hit Lucy in a way she didn't expect. There was no flirting in his tone. There were no games, there was only sincerity, and maybe that's what made her say something she never imagined. "All good." Thomas's eyes shone with something like surprise. "All good." She took the invitation and kept it in the bag. "Yes. But you don't think that means something?" Thomas smiled slowly, that crooked smile that made her heart beat a little faster. Lucy. You will be surprised." The following night Lucy looked in the mirror and felt a knot in her stomach. His black velvet dress embraced his curves elegantly, and his hair fell into soft waves. For the first time in years, she felt different, and that scared her. She didn't want that to mean anything, but when he heard the doorbell played and opened the door, he found Thomas stopped there, dressed in an impeccable suit and an intense look, and realized he was already lost. And that was a problem. Lucy had never felt so out of place. The five-star hotel hall shone under the crystal chandeliers, reflecting the opulence of designer dresses and tailor-made suits. The tilt of champagne glasses mingled with the buzz of sophisticated conversations, and Lucy, standing next to Thomas Lancaster, felt like an intruder in a world to which he did not belong. Thomas, on the other hand, was completely comfortable. He moved by the event with the grace of someone who had grown surrounded by this kind of luxury. Each smile was calculated, each hand tight was strategic. Even amid the elite of Los Angeles, he was still the center of attention. And Lucy was just the woman next to him. She tried to ignore the curious looks she received. The expressions evaluating the socialites and entrepreneurs who wondered who she was, why Thomas Lancaster had chosen to bring her. The doubt hovered in the air like an expensive perfume. And as much as I hated admitting, it bothered her. "Are you well?" Thomas's voice broke his thoughts. She blinked, bringing her eyes back to him. He watched her carefully, a light crease between the eyebrows. "Yes," she answered, forcing a smile. I'm not used to it." Thomas tilted his head, analyzing it. "With what?" She gestured vaguely to the hall. "With this world." "With all this ostentation." He smiled. "Fun. So pretend it's used to it." Lucy snorted. "Speaking is easy for you. No, it's not." Thomas took a sip of his drink before continuing. Do you think I was born comfortable in this environment? I had to learn. She looked at him with skepticism. Thomas, you were born in a golden cradle and yet I had to prove that I deserved to be here, he countered, without losing his composure. Money can put you in a salon like this, but it doesn't give you respect. This, you need to conquer. Lucy did not expect this answer. Before he could answer, a high and elegant woman approached, and the moment Lucy saw her smile, I knew something was about to go wrong. Thomas, the woman said with a calculated smile, her blue eyes shining with a familiarity that Lucy couldn't ignore. Thomas turned, his face assuming an expression of surprise. Contained Vanessa, he greeted without much enthusiasm. Lucy observed the interaction carefully. Vanessa. The name sounded sophisticated, just like everything in it. The red silk dress flowed perfectly through the slight body, and the expensive perfume made a subtle trail in the air. Lucy didn't need anything else to understand she was the kind of woman who belonged to that world. The type of woman who has had Thomas Lancaster. We haven't seen each other in a while, Vanessa continued, holding a glass of champagne with the lightness of those who had already attended many events like that. True, Thomas replied without much interest. Vanessa then looked away at Lucy, evaluating her from head to toe with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And you must be? Lucy opened her mouth to answer, but Thomas was faster. Lucy Harper, he said, his voice loaded with something Lucy couldn't decipher. Vanessa arched an eyebrow. Just that. An awe full of unnamed meanings. Lucy felt something turns around in her stomach. She didn't like that woman. So, Vanessa continued, gently spinning her champagne glass, are you? Thomas smiled, but there was something challenging in his expression. Together, Lucy arrested her breath. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her gaze fixed on her. Interesting. Lucy forced a smile, trying to keep her calm. And how did you know each other? Before Thomas could answer, Lucy went on. My car broke. He passed and tried to rescue me, but I refused his help. It was adorable. Thomas almost choked on his whiskey. Vanessa smiled, but Lucy realized that there was a cold shine in her eyes. Funny, the woman said softly. Thomas was never the type who accepts a rejection well. Lucy felt a chill through her spine. Vanessa leaned a little forward, as if about to tell a secret. I hope you know what you're getting into. Lucy narrowed her eyes. What do you mean by that? Vanessa gave a little smile, as if he was having fun with the question. I'm just saying that Thomas likes challenges. But when he finally wins them, he loses his interest. The pain came fast, acute, like a blade cutting skin. Thomas frowned at Vanessa. Enough, but the damage was already done. Lucy felt insecurity growing inside her, spreading like a poison. She looked at Thomas, looking for something in her expression that denied those words. Something that guaranteed that she was not just a game for him, but he hesitated. It was for a second. A minimal fraction of time, but it was enough. Vanessa smiled. Pleased. It was good to see you, Thomas. She turned and disappeared through the hall, leaving behind a heavy silence. Lucy walked away a step. Lucy. Thomas started, his lowest voice. She lifted her hand, interrupting it. You've done it before, don't you? He frowned. Made what? Chosen a woman just because she said no to you. Make it a game. He did not respond immediately. And his silence was a stronger blow than any word. Lucy felt a tightness in her chest. She was naive. She wanted to believe that Thomas was different, that he really cared, but now, all I could think was that maybe Vanessa was right. Maybe she was just another achievement for Thomas Lancaster. And maybe, the moment he felt he had it in his hands, he would get tired of her. I need some time, she said, taking a step back. Thomas advanced, trying to hold her by the arm. Lucy, don't do that, but she retreated. Good night, Thomas. And then, without looking back, Lucy left the event, leaving Thomas alone, and for the first time, not knowing how to fix it. The bookstore's bell sounded with a familiar tilt, but Lucy didn't look up. She was sitting behind the counter, trying to focus on a classic novel that she had read countless times. But the words mingled before his eyes, as if his mind refused to absorb them. Since the night of the charity event, a restlessness had taken over her. The judges, the veiled whispers, Vanessa's arrogant and elegant presence, sliding among the guests. As if there was still some kind of possession about Thomas. But nothing had affected her as much as his hesitation, that damn second in which he did not respond immediately. Thomas Lancaster hesitated in front of millionaire contracts? Faced with risky negotiations? No. He always knew exactly what to say. I always had the right words for each situation. So why wasn't you able to deny it immediately that she wasn't just a game? This thought tormented her, and deep down, Lucy knew she was afraid of the answer. Harper, we need to talk. Her voice crashed into his throat even before he could answer. She knew he would come. Since the night of the event, it had avoided any kind of contact. He had ignored calls, messages, even the expensive flowers bouquets that began to appear at the door of his bookstore every morning. But Thomas Lancaster was not the kind of man who agreed to be ignored. Lucy closed the book tightly and raised her head slowly. He was standing in front of him, as if he belonged to that space. What was ridiculous? Thomas did not belong there. It was not part of the world of old shelves and spent pages for time. It was glass, steel and dollarlets, but still, he was there, and his expression was different. There was no that playful glow in the eyes. No arrogant smile on the lips. There was something darker, a tension on the line of his jaw. Lucy swallowed hard. I have nothing to talk to you. Thomas ran a hand over his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. Lucy, please, please. The word sounded strange from him. As if you were not used to saying it. Lucy crossed her arms, keeping her strict posture. You hesitated, Thomas. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if he knew exactly what she was talking about. It was a second enough for me to understand everything. The silence between the two was heavy, loaded with something that threatened to crumble over both, and then the bookstore door opened again. Good morning, Harper. Brian Reynolds' voice broke the tense air, and Lucy saw Thomas stiffen beside her. Brian, Thomas's best friend. The man he was at the event with when it all started. She felt a cold in her spine. What do you want? Thomas asked, the lowest and threatening voice than Lucy had heard before. Brian, on the other hand, just smiled. A smile that didn't reach your eyes. Relax, Lancaster. I just wanted to see the woman who managed to put you on your knees. Lucy frowned. What are you talking about? Thomas took a deep breath, but Brian had already taken the reins of the conversation. Didn't he tell you? He laughed softly. Wow, Lancaster, I'm disappointed. Lucy felt her stomach turn around. Tell what? Thomas turned to her quickly. Lucy, don't listen to him. Oh, but I think she should, Brian interrupted, and then, looking straight at Lucy, played the truth as a knife. Night of the charity event. Thomas and I bet. I told him that you were a lost case, you would never give in. He said he would conquer you. Absolute silence. The world seemed to slow down around Lucy. She felt as if she had been hit by a punch in her chest. What? Thomas ran a hand over his face, exasperated. Lucy, did you make a bet to conquer me? Her voice was low, but loaded with something dangerous. Thomas took a step toward him. At first, maybe? But then after? Lucy laughed, a dry and humor laugh. Then what, Thomas? After you realized you were starting to like the game, you decided to increase the bet. Thomas closed his eyes. It wasn't like that, but Lucy didn't want to hear anymore. Her heart was beating out, the pain in her chest growing every second. She knew. From the beginning, I learned that Thomas Lancaster was a dangerous bet, and yet she fell. Lucy, she backed down a step, her teary eyes, but her expression was firm. I was a game for you. From the beginning. No, Thomas denied quickly. No more, but it was, she whispered. He tried to hold her by the arm, but she walked away. It's over, Thomas. The words came out sharply, definitive, and then, before he could say anything else, Lucy crossed the bookstore and left the doors, leaving Thomas stopped there, and for the first time in his life, he realized that losing something really mattered. The silence inside the bookstore was suffocating. Thomas was still standing in the same place where Lucy had left him, feeling a strange void spread inside him. She left. It didn't shouted. It didn't cry. He didn't play anything on him, she just left, and that was infinitely worse. Thomas Lancaster didn't know what to do with that feeling. He, who always had everything under control, who always knew exactly how to act in any situation, was now there, in the midst of a small bookstore full of old books, realizing that he had lost the only thing he really wanted in his life. Congratulations, Lancaster. Brian's voice sounded with fun, but Thomas didn't even look at him. She fled as if she had seen a ghost, and then something inside it exploded before Brian could react. Thomas grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and pushed him against the nearest shelf. Some books fell, but Thomas didn't care. His blood boiled, his breath was short and quick. You spoiled everything. Your voice was serious, loaded with anger. Brian did not look shaken. He laughed, without bothering with Thomas's aggressiveness. You dug your grave yourself, my friend. Thomas squeezed his fists. You knew what you were doing. Brian raised his hands in false innocence. Of course I knew. I wanted to see how far you would go. And, look, it looks like you went too far. Thomas felt a wave of hatred take over him. But then, anger gave way to something worse, despair sleeping Brian tightly. He retreated a step. Lucy would never talk to him again, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix it. Lucy drove aimlessly for almost an hour, his hands shake on the wheel, and his mind was absolute chaos. She felt ridiculous. How could she have been so stupid? From the beginning, from that arrogant first look, she knew that Thomas Lancaster was a dangerous game. He knew he was the kind of man who did not accept a no and who loved challenges, and yet she allowed herself to believe that, perhaps, only maybe he could be different. But now, every look, every word, every moment they shared, everything seemed false. The pain in her chest was suffocating, and worst of all was that, despite all, she missed him and hated it. Thomas Lancaster was not a man who regretted his decisions, but now, while staring at the lighted city of Los Angeles from the top of its luxurious coverage, the weight of repentance crushed him. He couldn't sleep. I couldn't work. His mind was a whirlwind of memories. The way Lucy smiled when talking about old books, the shine in his eyes when he discussed something he was in love with, the way she challenged him, how she was never impressed by her money or her influence. She saw him. The true he, and now, she hated him. He took the cell phone, his fingers hesitating on the screen. 24 unlisted calls. No answer. Thomas never had to fight for anyone, but for her, he would fight because now he knew it wasn't just a game. It was not a bet. He loved Lucy Harper and would not let her escape. Lucy forced to return to the routine. The bookstore was its refuge. Your world. But now, everything seemed wrong. Every morning she unconsciously waited to hear the bell of the door play and see Thomas entering, with that convinced smile and a coffee in her hand. But he didn't show up until, 5 days later, he appeared, and something in it was different. He did not wear his usual impeccable suit. It only wore a white shirt with folded sleeves and dark pants. Her hair was slightly messy, and her eyes had shadows that weren't there before. Lucy swallowed hard. What do you want? Her voice came out lower than she wanted. Thomas stuck his hands in his pockets and let out a sigh. I want to tell you the truth. Lucy crossed her arms, feeling the anger and the pain mingled inside her. I know the truth. He shook his head. No. You know the beginning. But not what happened next. Lucy bit her lip. She should send him away, but it couldn't because, despite everything, she wanted to hear, and maybe that was the most dangerous of everything. She didn't want to give Thomas Lancaster one more chance to mess up her head, to make her heart forget the pain he had caused. But there he was, standing in the middle of his bookstore, looking at her with an expression that did not match the man Lucy knew. He looked tired, exhausted, even as if the last week had drained all his energy, and that bothered her because if there was someone who didn't have the right to suffer, that one was Thomas Lancaster. Lucy crossed her arms, maintaining an impassive expression. You have 5 minutes. Thomas slowly dropped the air, as if preparing for an impact. I should never have made that bet. She laughed, a cold sound, loaded with irony. I'm glad you realized this after I found out. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. At first, yes, it was a stupid game. But, Lucy. He stepped ahead, and she immediately took one back. He noticed, and his expression softened. You were not just a challenge for me. You were the only person who saw me beyond the facade. Lucy squeezed her lips. It doesn't change anything. He ran a hand over his hair, frustrated. I know. But I needed to say. Lucy hated the way his voice seemed different. As there was no arrogance there. No attempt at manipulation. Just honesty. But she couldn't believe it. Not is that all? She asked, forcing indifference. Thomas hesitated, and then, sticking his hand in the jacket pocket, he removed a thick envelope and placed it over the counter. Lucy frowned. What is that? He leaned lightly at her. The reason I haven't appeared here in recent days. Lucy took the envelope with suspicion and opened it, his eyes sweeping his pages inside it, and then, your heart stopped. It was a deed from the bookstore. She looked at him confused. Thomas, what is this? He took a deep breath. I bought the building. The shock traveled her body like lightning. What? The building was about to be sold to a developer. In a month, the bookstore would be demolished. Didn't you know that? Lucy felt the floor disappear under her feet. She didn't know. Thomas ran his hand over his face, clearly nervous. I discovered a few days ago. And the only way to prevent it was to buy it before the sale was completed. Lucy blinked, trying to sou. He held her eyes. The bookstore is yours now. The shock prevented her from speaking for long seconds. Did you buy it for me? Thomas released a low laugh. But there was no humor of her. You think I would care about another building? He stepped forward, and this time Lucy didn't go back. I did it because this place is you. Because I know what this bookstore means to you. She felt her eyes burning, but would not let tears fall. Why did you do that, Thomas? He looked into her eyes, his voice coming out low, almost a whisper. Because I love you, Lucy. And at that moment, everything inside it collapsed. The silence between them was so deep that Lucy could hear her own heart beating hard inside her chest. He said he loved her, and the worst, she believed, the man who only played with the words, who never hesitated, was now standing before her, vulnerable in a way that Lucy never imagined seeing. And that scared her more than anything. She took a deep breath. I need to think. The pain passed his face for a brief moment, but then he nodded. All good. She looked at the envelope in her hands. Is that real? Yes. And it will remain yours, regardless of our history. That phrase, that damn phrase did something inside her because it was not a game.it, was not a bet.it, was love. She said nothing more, and Thomas just nodded one last time before leaving the bookstore, leaving Lucy there, lost between fear and hope. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe there was still a chance for them. Lucy Harper was never the type who believed in happy endings. She always saw love as something too delicate, too fragile. Like yellowish pages of an ancient book, look at the look, but easy to tear. And yet, there she was. On the bookstore's porch, sitting in a wooden chair with a cup of coffee between hands, watching the city wake up around it, and waiting for him. The doorbell rang behind her, and Lucy didn't have to turn around to know who it was. She felt Thomas's presence even before he spoke. "Are you sure you're awake?" She smiled. "Are you sure you shouldn't be wearing a suit?" He laughed, approaching and leaning on the doorway, holding a brown paper bag that, Lucy knew, contained croissants from her favorite bakery. He always brought coffee and croissants to her. Now a small but significant gesture, because Thomas Lancaster has always had the whole world at his reach, but now he made a point of gaining small parts of hers. He stretched the paper bag to her. "Temporary peace?" She took croissant, arising an eyebrow. "Does that mean you're planning to do something that pisses me off later?" Thomas gave a crooked smile, the one who always made her roll her eyes, but now she also made her heart beat faster. "I'm me." "Of course," Lucy laughed, swinging her head. She couldn't deny it. Thomas was still unbearable. It was still arrogant. It was still full of yourself, but now, there was something different about him. He was no longer just Thomas Lancaster, the CEO playboy that never accepted a no. He was the man who loved her, the man who waited as long as she was ready to try, the man who, instead of promising he would never go wrong, promised that he would always try to be better, and against all your own expectations. Lucy was willing to try too. What it was? Thomas asked, leaning his head. She realized she was staring at him, lost in her own thoughts. Lucy just smiled and had a sip of coffee. Nothing, but he knew it was nothing, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The wind blown gently around them, mixing the aroma of hot coffee and old pages of the bookstore, and while Lucy Harper bit a croissant and Thomas Lancaster watching her with a smile on her face, it was clear that story was not about happy endings. It was about new beginnings. Our story for today comes to an end, friends, but before we say goodbye, I need your help to keep this rhythm of stories alive. If this story moved, inspired, or simply entertained you, don't hesitate to give this video a like. It's as simple as a click, but it means the world to us. Do you want more stories like this one? Then subscribe to Happiness of Love and don't forget to activate the notification bell so you never miss any of our new adventures. Remember, we have a new video every 2 days. Share this video with your friends and family. Who knows? You might inspire someone to make a positive change in the world. Leave us a comment letting us know which part of the story touched your heart the most. We love reading your thoughts and connecting with you. And if you're watching this on your phone, don't forget to hit the hype button to show your enthusiasm and help us reach even more people with these inspiring stories. Thank you for being part of the Happiness of Love community. Your support is like the heartbeat of this channel, vital and full of life. Oh, and before you go, check out the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another amazing story you won't want to miss. See you in 2 days with another story that will take your breath away. Until then, keep the rhythm of love and inspiration alive, one beat at a time.